A Wizard of Earthsea, first published in 1968, is the tale of a young boy whose mother died when he was a baby. He's taken care of by a cruel aunt. When he starts to exhibit magical abilities, he ends up attending a faraway school for wizards, a place protected by magic from outsiders. In this world, wizards and witches are essentially normal people who happen to be born with magic power and must learn to control that power. At the school, the boy meets his new best friend, a guy who'll stay by his side into adulthood. He also meets a posh bully who makes his life miserable. An elderly, celibate wizard with a bird runs the school but tragically dies to protect our hero. You can't miss our protagonist in a crowd because of the scars on his face. He's the only one who can challenge the enemy with whom he shares a magical connection.
And that's the first Earthsea book by Ursula K. Le Guin, A Wizard of Earthsea, published 29 years before the first publication of Harry Potter, except none of these characters are white. Earthsea is generally credited as the first novel about a school for wizards and the origin of the boy wizard. Inspired by the works of J.R. Tolkien and T.H. White, Le Guin's books have been a huge influence in the fantasy literary world. They've inspired works by Neil Gaiman and George R.R. Martin, Terry Pratchett, Robin Hobb. They inspired the film Tales from Earthsea by Studio Ghibli, as well as inspired the magic system in Spirited Away. Margaret Atwood called Le Guin one of the literary greats of the 20th century. Unlike Rowling's and Tolkien's works, Earthsea has never been adapted to mainstream cinema, so people don't really know a lot about it. But is it possible that Earthsea is the missing link between Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter? Is it possible that without Earthsea, Harry Potter might never have existed? You've probably heard of the wizard Merlin and King Arthur, and you know Merlin as the wacky wizard who helps Arthur learn to become the great king he's destined to be. Well, I'm sure you also know that Merlin is the son of Satan. Really, he was the Antichrist.
In the early legends, Merlin was born the son of a nun and a demon. Luckily, after his birth, his mother summoned a priest who baptized the baby Merlin, thus saving him from his satanic destiny.
But being the son of the devil and also blessed by God, he's left with amazing powers of knowledge and prophecy. Merlin has gone through many incarnations over the last 1,000 years. The popular incarnation of Merlin over the 20th century was in large part inspired by T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone, where Merlin is a wacky comical magician living his life backwards, hence his prophetic powers. This version of Merlin has all sorts of weird and wonderful magic powers of transformation and weather control and teleportation. The Lord of the Rings Gandalf was inspired in part by earlier myths of Merlin, but not Merlin alone. I don't know if you know this, but Gandalf is not a real wizard. Like Merlin, his origins are a little more obscure. For years, the origin of Gandalf was left up to readers' imaginations. It wasn't until after Tolkien's death...
Tolkien.
What?
Tolkien.
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 Tolkien?
Tolkien.
I've been saying Tolkien's name wrong my whole life. Tolkien.
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 Tolkien! It wasn't until after Tolkien's death, when the Silmarillion was published in 1977, that we found out exactly what Gandalf is. Turns out, he's not a man, he's not an elf, he's an angel. Where Merlin is the son of Satan, Gandalf is literally an angelic being. He was never born, he just sort of always was, existing as a spirit in Middle-earth before he became corporeal. The other half of Gandalf's inspiration comes from Norse mythology. That image of Gandalf as a wanderer with a staff and a wide-brimmed hat, that is a reflection of Odin, father of Thor. So neither Merlin nor Gandalf was actually human, and both sort of served God with their powers. Nowadays we tend to see wizards as just people who have special powers, but that's not always been the case. Ursula K. Le Guin was a huge Tolkien fan. After the books first came out in 1956, she read them so many times that by 1974 she'd lost count how many times she'd read them, and she read them aloud to each of her children.
The Lord of the Rings was kind of the book I'd wanted to read all my life, in a way. So, of course, it had an enormous influence on me. It just kind of showed me what you could do with fantasy.
You can see very early on the influence of Lord of the Rings and The Sword in the Stone on the Earthsea books. In 1964, before writing the Earthsea books, Le Guin published a short story called The Rule of Names. This story has a very Hobbit feel to it and a main character named Mr. Underhill.
Underhill. My name's Underhill.
But our expectations are subverted when it is revealed that the character is a shape-shifting dragon. Le Guin expects us to have read earlier fantasy works, and here she comes to subvert our expectations, which is a theme that continues throughout the Earthsea books. And that's part of what makes him so iconic. Le Guin was inspired to write the first Earthsea book when she was asked by a publisher if she could write a story for young adults. Not knowing if she was even capable of that, she started to wonder, what kind of younger character could she write about?
Wizards are usually elderly or ageless Gandalfs, quite rightly and archetypically. But what were they before they had white beards? How did they learn what is obviously an erudite and dangerous art? Are there colleges for young wizards?
While Merlin clearly influenced the magic of Earthsea, the story isn't really about wizards like Merlin, it's more about wizards like Gandalf. Or rather, what we know about Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, before he was outed as an angel. Wizards who are wanderers, who survive not by owning property, but by caring for the community and surviving off of their goodwill. Wizards who work in hierarchies with councils. Gandalf has many names, he has no money, no home. As far as any reader of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit knows, Gandalf's just a kind old man, wandering around, living off of the goodwill of the peoples of Middle-earth and Bilbo's pantry. So if I were Le Guin in the 1960s, with the publication of the Silmarillion still a decade away, I might wonder, where did Gandalf get his powers? Where did the Council of the Wise learn to become wizards? And how are they woven into the fabric of this society? So from all this information composted grew the sapling of what would become Earthsea and the Roke School for Wizards. Earthsea may have been the first novel to feature a school for wizards, but Harry Potter was pretty far from being the second.
There's Terry Pratchett's Unseen University in Discworld, Jill Murphy's The Worst Witch, Jane Yolen's Wizard's Hall. Even the idea of a magic gateway at a platform at King's Cross Station isn't particularly original.
Of course, J.K. Rowling cites none of these as inspirations, rather the Bible and Shakespeare and Jane Austen were her inspirations for Harry Potter, which I'm sure is true enough.
She also cites T.H. White and The Sword in the Stone as an influence, saying the young King Arthur is a spiritual ancestor to Harry. She has admitted to reading Tolkien, with whom she has a few similarities, a Dark Lord slowly returning to power through the use of magical objects in which he placed a part of himself. Aragog resembles Shelob, the Whomping Willow is quite similar to Old Man Willow, the Dementors seem very, very similar to the Ringwraiths. Dumbledore is quite reminiscent of Gandalf. I mean, to be honest, it's hard to escape the influence of something as massive and foundational as Tolkien.
And there's nothing wrong with works being inspired by other works. You know, Earthsea was inspired by Tolkien and White was inspired by Mallory and Arthurian legend. Tolkien was inspired by, everyone. But, it's just nice to give credit where it's due. When Earthsea was first published, Rowling was only about 3 years old. By the time she started writing Harry Potter, there were 4 books in the Earthsea series, as well as various short stories. By the 1990s, Earthsea had a significant influence. You can see it in the works of Neil Gaiman, Robin Hobb, Terry Pratchett. George R.R. Martin went on to say that without books like Earthsea, books such as the Song of Fire and Ice series, the Game of Thrones books, could never have existed. Earthsea was influential. It was the first book about a wizarding school. It's been translated into languages all over the world, and J.K. Rowling has never acknowledged that it even exists. It's possible that she never read it. It's possible that she read it when she was a little kid and forgot. It's possible that she just read the blurb on the back of the book. Whatever the case may be, J.K. Rowling was raised in a world where the wizarding school and the boy wizard were most definitely a thing. To be honest, Earthsea is very different from Harry Potter, and Ged only spends a brief time at the wizard school, but it still feels very Harry Potter. It feels like a brief overview of a Harry Potter book. All the basic elements of Harry Potter are sort of in place. And actually, having read all of Harry Potter, the school in Earthsea feels a little bit underwhelming, because I feel like I've experienced wizard school in such great detail through Harry Potter. But to readers in the 1960s, this would have felt very new, very original. After constantly being compared to J.K. Rowling, Le Guin decided to check out the first Harry Potter book, which she described as good fare for its age group, but stylistically ordinary, imaginatively derivative, and ethically rather mean-spirited.
I didn't feel she ripped me off as some people did, though she could have been more gracious about her predecessors. My incredulity was at the critics who found the first book wonderfully original. She has many virtues, but originality is not one of them. That hurt.
The 1960s was the era of the civil rights movement in America. Star Trek was that radical, racially diverse show. Martin Luther King Jr. was changing the future of the country with his words and dreams. It was in this cultural context that Le Guin began to write A Wizard of Earthsea, in which the hero is a man of colour. In fact, most of the characters in the book are people of colour. The white people living in the Kargad lands are seen as savages. As Le Guin put it,
My color scheme was conscious and deliberate from the start. I didn't see why everybody in science fiction had to be a honky named Bob or Joe or Bill. I have heard not often, but memorably from readers of color who told me that the Earthsea books were the only books in the genre that they felt included in, and how much this meant to them, particularly as adolescents, when they'd found nothing to read in fantasy and science fiction except the adventures of white people in white worlds. So far, no reader of color has told me I ought to butt out, or that I got the ethnicity wrong. When they do, I'll listen. As an anthropologist's daughter, I am intensely conscious of the risk of cultural or ethnic imperialism, a white writer speaking for non-white people co-opting their voice, an act of extreme arrogance.
The Lord of the Rings doesn't have the best track record for diversity, which I'm sure we'll come up with various excuses for in the comments, but there's also the issue of the orcs, which the orcs are the primary dark-skinned characters in the stories. I don't believe that Tolkien had anywhere near the kind of racist perspectives that Nazis project onto The Lord of the Rings. In 1937, a German publisher was interested in translating The Hobbit into German, and they wrote him a letter asking if he was of Aryan descent. He was pretty pissed off by this.
I have many Jewish friends, and should regret giving any colour to the notion that I subscribed to the wholly pernicious and unscientific race doctrine.
Tolkien hated Hitler, whom he called a ruddy little ignoramus. Overall, Tolkien doesn't seem to have been racist on a conscious level. However, the way he describes orcs indicates a certain preference for features typically associated with white people. And just the idea that there's sort of like an ethnic group in Middle-earth who's just like inherently evil is... Even though I don't think it was Tolkien's intention, a lot of white supremacists are very into Lord of the Rings, and that's very sad. The same cannot be said for Earthsea. But okay, if we want to just say Tolkien was a product of his time, okay, Ursula K. Le Guin was also a product of her time, and she'd decided that we'd had enough white wizards, and I don't mean Saruman. She took what was great, she took what was awesome about some of her fantasy literature predecessors, and she took what wasn't so great and she subverted those tropes. Now, I would like to say that Harry Potter continued this tradition of learning from the mistakes of earlier authors, but did it? Harry Potter isn't really known for its diversity, and when Rowling does attempt to portray characters of colour, like Cho Chang, it leaves something to be desired. Cho isn't a first name, it's a surname. The name Cho Chang kind of doesn't make much sense. In a world where most of the characters have really well thought out names like Remus Lupin and Sirius Black, Cho Chang feels lazy and inconsiderate. And when it comes to portrayals of fictional races, like with Tolkien, Rowling leaves something to be desired and possibly betrays certain unconscious attitudes about race. When Hermione takes up the fight against the species-based slavery of the house elves, she's just mocked by the main characters, and I don't feel the text ever really justifies her activism. Some people just like being slaves. Personally, I really enjoy the subversion of race in Earthsea, and I love seeing how these old archetypes can change and evolve. I think this was a huge improvement from Tolkien to Le Guin. That being said, there is a pretty misogynist undertone to the original Earthsea trilogy, which can be quite hard to read.
The Earthsea books as feminist literature are a total, complete bust from my own archetypes and from my own cultural upbringing. I couldn't go down deep and come up with a woman wizard. Maybe I'll learn to eventually, but when I wrote those, I couldn't do it. I wish I could have.
To be a wizard is prestigious and respectable. To be a witch is demeaning. While wizards go to the wizard school, witches are not permitted. In fact, women aren't allowed in the school at all. There's a saying on Earthsea, weak as women's magic, wicked as women's magic. But in the last 3 books of Earthsea, the whole perspective is turned on its head. We no longer see the world through the perspective of the greatest archmage, dragon lord Ged. We see the world through the perspective of
someone who is powerless. Specifically, we see the world of magic and dragons and quests through the perspective of a middle-aged housewife. Suddenly, weak is women's magic, wicked is women's magic doesn't seem to be a truth of this world at all. It's just misogyny. The magic of witches often involves scraps of spells picked up from wizards who generally keep their magic secret. They keep their spells a secret. Witches instead work with herbs and function as healers for the village, and also usually as midwives. Despite being absolutely vital to the function of society, to the birth of the children of the world, witches are seen as less than. Men like Ged are celebrated for their craft despite any harm they might have inadvertently done, while women, witches, are looked down upon. It's an amazing and shocking twist which displeased a lot of the older fans, particularly men, and delighted me, to be honest. 18 years passed between the third Earthsea book and the fourth Earthsea book. Le Guin had changed, the world had changed. In 1987, Terry Pratchett published his third Discworld novel, Equal Rights, which is very clearly inspired by A Wizard of Earthsea. He takes this idea of a boys-only wizard school and pits it against the feminism of the era. Why shouldn't girls be allowed in a wizard school? That's a bit sexist, isn't it? What's the point of that? I don't know if Le Guin had read Equal Rights. I know that later on she was a fan of Terry Pratchett's, but either way, she goes on to pose similar questions to Terry Pratchett's in her later books. As it happens, we learn that the history of the wizard school was actually extremely inclusive, and women were vital co-founders of the wizard school. It was just that later on, the guys decided that being tempted by women would weaken their power. We learn that fear of truly powerful women and girls leads to violent abuse. Why aren't there any female wizards? Why are men stronger, more powerful than women? It's not just because that's how the world works, women are weaker, but because it is enforced systemically and violently. In the final two books of Earthsea, Le Guin reveals that there is a certain bisexual culture to witch life.
Though seldom celibate, witches seldom kept company more than a night or two with any man, and it was a rare thing for a witch to marry a man. Far more often, two of them lived their lives together, and that was called witch marriage, or she-troth.
One character says he has two mothers, both witches, which is unsurprising to our hero Ged. We find out that all along this has been a normal part of their culture that we just weren't privy to because we saw the world through a different lens. This was 2001, 6 years before Rowling would go on to reveal, after the publication of the last Harry Potter book, that she had known that Dumbledore was gay all along.
This is before the publication of Philosopher's Stone, so bear in mind, at this point, I've been with him for 7 years. I knew he was gay. I just knew he was gay.
A lot has been said about Rowling's constant revelations about the world of Harry Potter, that she always knew this, that and the other. She always knew Nagini was a human. She always knew that wizards pooped on the floor. But I must admit, it seems a little bit more likely to me that she conceived of Dumbledore in the same tradition of the wizards in Earthsea and Gandalf as celibate characters, and only later sort of went on to ship Dumbledore with Grindelwald. I don't know if this was the case, but if she really did know all along, then frankly I'm disappointed. By 2007 she was a major power in the world of literature, and she was already a millionaire. Like, she could have just said something, she could have done something. No one could have stopped her, and now she's writing the Fantastic Beasts films, which still beat around the bush. In Earthsea, I knew how witches fit into the world. I knew already, and this new revelation makes perfect sense in the context that I already understood. But where does being gay fit into the culture of the world of Harry Potter? Is same-sex marriage legal? Was there an uprising at the Leaky Cauldron? Do they have pride marches every year? If being gay has always been something that no one cares about, then why is the world of Harry Potter so deeply, painfully heterosexual? We can have a world where a tiny little man bangs a giant woman, and that's fine, and that's normal, but we can't have a single same-sex couple. To J.K. Rowling, a world where homophobia doesn't exist looks an awful lot like a world where gay people don't exist. J.K. Rowling is traditional. The epilogue of Harry Potter made that clear. Her views on trans people made that clear.
Dumbledore supposedly being gay doesn't absolve her of anything. You were not an ally because you made an evil gay and a good gay who must remain celibate for his entire life and then die, and no one ever talks about the gayness. Do I sound better? I'm fine. I'm fine. Another thing that I really enjoy about Earthsea is that to Le Guin, the world is contained within the pages of the book. She doesn't make up answers to your questions to expand the world. She is not the boss of the world. The book speaks for itself. The book is art.
Early in the 2000s, both The Lord of the Rings and the first Harry Potter books were adapted into enormously successful films, cementing the imagery of both series in cinematic history and the minds of fantasy fans across the world. At the same time, Le Guin was approached about adapting Earthsea. The result of Broken Promises was a horrible whitewashed live-action adaptation starring Shawn Ashmore as a rather pale version of Ged. Considering how explicitly race is discussed in the books, adapting it in this colour-blind way, which just so happens to favour white people, really feels like a mockery. The producers had told Le Guin that they'd secured Philippa Boyens, co-writer of the Lord of the Rings films, to write the adaptation, which I don't know if that was just a lie or what, because that's not who wrote it. I genuinely feel like the producers of this miniseries just hated Le Guin's writing and did not understand what made the books good, and I think Le Guin felt the same way. The books A Wizard of Earthsea and The Tombs of Atuan, which were published more than 30 years ago, are about two young people finding out what their power, their freedom, and their responsibilities are. I don't know what the film is about. It's full of scenes from the story, arranged differently, in an entirely different plot, so that they make no sense. Ged with a white face is a lie, a betrayal of the book and of the potential reader. I think it is possible that some readers never even notice what color the people in the story are. Don't notice, don't care. Whites, of course, have the privilege of not caring, of being color-blind. Nobody else does. A few years later, we had hope in Studio Ghibli's adaptation of the third and fourth Earthsea books, but this adaptation was just bizarre and favours violence over the themes of the book. Much of it was, I thought, incoherent. This may be because I kept trying to find and follow the story of my books while watching an entirely different story, confusingly enacted by people with the same names as in my story, but with entirely different temperaments, histories, and destinies. But in the film, evil has been comfortably externalized in a villain, the wizard, Cobb, who can simply be killed, thus solving all problems. In modern fantasy, literary or governmental, killing people is the usual solution to the so-called war between good and evil. My books are not conceived in terms of such a war, and offer no simple answers to simplistic questions.
I think Earthsea is inherently quite a difficult series to adapt. Each book differs so dramatically in tone from the last that if you made a series of films, you'd end up with quite a muddled series, which might not seem adequately profitable to Hollywood. But to be honest, I don't think Ursula K. Le Guin would care about that.
Books, they're not just commodities. The profit motive is often in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings.
Before Le Guin's death, she agreed to the production of a new series of Earthsea films, which since then has been announced to be a television series. There's not a lot of information yet about the Earthsea television series, but her son Theo is going to be an executive producer on it, so fingers crossed, the series will at least be true to the spirit of the books.
Last summer was tough for everyone. Some more than others. I was okay, relatively speaking, but I needed a world to get lost in. I thought about rereading Harry Potter, but that feeling, knowing how she felt about people like me, that she was willing to throw us under the bus, for me, it's hard to separate the books from that nagging connotation of the author in the back of my mind. So I turned to Earthsea, which I had never read before, and I got to see this journey. The journey of a woman who was already open-minded to begin with, but she changed and grew. And as she grew, so did her work. What a beautiful experience it is to see the same world revisited by someone who has come to care about feminism, who passionately invests her energy into writing about it, who cares enough to just casually mention that, hey, your hero Ged, he knew queer witches all along and it just never bothered him. I find it difficult to get over some of the content in Harry Potter, the spew stuff, constantly making fun of Hermione for caring about what is really a human rights issue. I think Ursula K. Le Guin would not have sided with Rowling on all this. I really believe that. Le Guin embraced diversity and cultural differences. It was essential to her work, and if nothing else, she wouldn't have made any ridiculous tweets on a topic she knew nothing about. And that's part of why I find so much comfort in Earthsea. The real fight of Lord of the Rings isn't with Sauron, it's Frodo against his temptation. Ged's real battle in Earthsea is with himself. I think we all identify with these themes, they're universal. I want to be a good person. I want to be kind. I want to help people. I want to set a good example, and when I die, I want the world to be ever so slightly better for my having chosen to stick around as long as I did. I actually have a lot of anxiety over this. I worry about how I might fail at goodness and kindness, and I spend a lot of time on the internet. Being a leftist on social media is a little scary. The need for perfection, for social purity, is encouraged by a very vigilant online community with mixed motivations for calling out transgressions. And even when I don't mess up and I don't get in trouble, I find myself in the middle of a culture war where the author of some cute kind of centrist books I like turns out to be encouraging hostility towards people like me. So one thing that has helped me during these particularly trying times is finding something kind of outside the discourse, outside of the moment. Earthsea has been that for me. But it's also been incredible to see someone well-meaning make mistakes while trying to do good and later come back and do her best to make up for them. To then see that in the broader context of cultural history, of storytelling, we can all change. And I don't begrudge Le Guin what I think were her earlier mistakes. And if I can forgive her for not being perfect from day one, maybe I can forgive myself for not being perfect. And if she can change, if the way we tell stories can change and evolve, maybe there's hope for all of us. Thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to... Sorry, this is embarrassing. Hello?
Hey there, VB. It's your friend and fellow YouTuber, Jesse Gender, or JG as the youths like to call me.
Oh, hey Jesse.
Look, love the vid. I think you got pizzazz, kid. But I did notice a few things. When you're talking about Earthsea, you didn't bring up the amazing magic system that Ursula Le Guin, LG herself, came up with, as well as the interesting transgender narrative parallels in the second book of the Earthsea series, Tombs of Atuan.
But how do you know? I'm still filming. The video isn't online.
I got contacts, kid. I got contacts.
Listen, I'm done with the video. I don't have time to shoot more. I can't make a whole extra chapter on the magic system and the tombs of Atuan. Atuan?
Atuan?
Atuan.
Atuin.
Atuan.
Kid, don't sweat it. I got this. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it, okay? Wait here. I'll be back in a few weeks with my own video on Earthsea.
Jesse? Okay, well, like and subscribe, and maybe check out Jessie's channel as well, because I think she's serious about this. Thank you so much for watching this video, which was actually just an excuse for me to chat about some books that I like. I tried to avoid as many spoilers as I could, so if you want to read the books, I hope you enjoy them. Thank you to all my patrons, and a special thanks to Kat R, Danny Aidenstone, Hannah Acker, Siobhan, Aaron, AJ, Apathetic Gaiety, Eric Parkinson, B, Charis Edwards, Dweebin, ES, Eerie NB, Felixer of Life, Gavin Salmon, Hackneyed Edits, Juicy Fantasy Queen Plant Hookups, Jules, Juliana C, Julius, Kale, Kate and Jess, Kisa, Lacey Cox, Lillian Brink, Lord Asriel, Marla, Miss Mad, Nico, Nick Snary, Nina, Oddbjorn the Frizzy, Olive, Pregnant Seinfeld, Rebecca Peacock, Rock the Shell, Ryan Peters, Saint Laura, Samson Lopez, Sarah R, Sawyer Donk, Shaved Headed By, Sithvich, Soy, Spaghetti Rabbit, Steve, Straw Fox, Susie S, Svipul the trans boy Valkyrie, the children of Jack Acid, Tia Till, Tina Gigya, Verlux, and Will O'Connor.